I'm Sabri Adel Sadi, and I'm the coordinator for the Francophone services at CRIVAC of Center of Western Ontario. We at the Learning Network and the Knowledge Hub welcome you to this webinar on understanding the realities of gender diverse peoples to strengthen our care systems. I would like to mention that our work is taking place on the traditional nations of the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, Lenni-Ausawuk, and the Shonotone peoples. These lands are related to the Treaty of 1796 and to the Bowl with One Spoon Treaty. We recognize the lands of Indigenous sovereignty. We also recognize that many Black people were violently brought to Canada due to colonialism and slavery. We will continue to work with communities to fight against colonialism, racism against Black persons and others, which remain omnipresent in Canada and which disproportionately affect them in terms of violence, sexual violence or gender violence. Today, we're happy to have with us Zakary-Georges Gagné. She is non-binary, Francophone, transfeminine and Cree individual. Zachary directs the Francophone Engagement Coordinator at the Enchanté Network, Canada's largest network of 2S LGBTQI+ organizations, and president of Franco Queer, Ontario's provincial association for LGBTQIA2+ Francophones. And now over to Zakary-Georges. My name is Zakary-Georges, and I'm very happy to be spending a little bit of time with you today. If you will allow, before I start giving my presentation, I would like to do my land acknowledgement. Throughout Canada, unceded nations are the home to many Aboriginal communities. We are on the ancestral territories of many Indigenous peoples. Where I am is the treaty number 6, where Crees, Pieds-Noirs, Métis, Sioux, Nakota, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many other people live. The network of the Enchanté network is on the Algonquin lands. I live in Cataraqui, which is also known as Kingston, Ontario, which is the traditional land of many peoples, the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, and Haudenosaunee. Our network creates safe spaces for two-spirit people, queers, and this includes the leaders of the Métis, First Nations, Inuit, and First Nations peoples. We recognize that that problems continue in the world, and we know that some of us participate and benefit from colonization. And recognition of this is our starting point. To do our share, we have to listen, amplify, and implement calls for justice for Indigenous communities. We also ask you to think about this today, and after the workshop, continue to think about your relationship with the land that you live on, with the people who have taken care of these lands and continue to do so, and listen to the experiences of those who live on these lands and who have been impacted by colonization. Thank you very much for having listened to this. So now I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Zakary-Georges Gagné. I use she and they in English. I'm the coordinator of Francophone engagement at the Enchanté Network. I'm very happy to be here with you and take some time to help you learn a little bit about gender diverse people. I am going to be talking about the Francophone minority context also, and I will end by talking about ways that we can better create safe spaces together. As Sabri mentioned before, I'm a non-binary person, I'm trans feminine, and I am from the Cree First Nation. I introduced myself in Cree before. It's not a language that I speak, but I'm learning it every day. And it's very important for me to use it as often as possible because it is a language that's disappearing. And there are many problems and stereotypes related to Aboriginal languages. I'm a Francophone in a minority setting. And of course, Indigenous languages are very minority language, and we should talk, but we should mention that they exist. And I really wanted to present myself in Cree today before starting this workshop. So let me tell you a bit more about who I am and how I walk through the world. I'm an artist. I'm also an author and someone who loves the outdoors, interpersonal relationships. And that's why I'm here with you today to talk to you about my work within my communities. This work is fueled by my desire to ask questions. And some of the people I share my daily life with call me a detective of everyday life, because I ask a lot of questions and I always go to people who can answer them for me. So I would be happy to answer questions for you. And I can't wait for you to become to take the role of asking questions at the end of this workshop during the question and answer period.
Du réseau Enchanté, comme Sabri a dit, je porte deux
Before
chapeaux.
talking to you about the Réseau network, or the Enchanté network, I'd like to mention that I wear two hats. I'm a coordinator for the Francophone engagement at the Enchanté network. I don't know what you know about this network, but basically it's a nonprofit national organization. It's the largest network of two SLGBTQI plus organizations in Canada. We have more than 200 members in each of the provinces and territories in Canada, or the land we call Canada today. And we offer various services across the country: support services, peer support services, community health services, research, help accessing services, and many others. As a network, we have three objectives: to help our member organizations to fulfill their mandate. We want to bring together our organizations. That's why we exist. We're there to unite the various movements and to work on what's happening in the national sector. We're also there to support them and give them information and resources. And we also work constantly as advocates, defending our member organizations and our communities through various initiatives. We work with funding organizations, governments, and other bodies that have an influence on the 2SLGBTQ plus people. And I work in particular with Francophone communities and Francophone organizations who serve Francophones throughout the country. We have approximately 22 organizations that are serving French-speaking minority communities and 28 core organizations in Quebec. So I work with about 50 organizations, offering them support, bringing them together, and helping them to defend their rights, advocating for them via various initiatives. I am also the president of Franco-Queer. It's an Ontario organization that represents 2S LGBTQI plus individuals who are Francophones. So I'm speaking to you from these two professional roles that I play, from my personal life, and to tell you about what I've learned thanks to the research that I've done over the years. So before going into today's content, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the work that I have done over the years and the approach that I use to do my job. It's important for me to share this with you so that everyone understands where my ideas come from and what they're based on. And over the last 3 years, I've worked mainly on Francophone minority communities, on sexual and gender diversity, and also on Indigenous identities. It's a privilege and a challenge to work on these three identity-related issues, and it's a challenge to share these identities through the work that I do, since it is indeed a very personal, it's very personal work, greatly based on my personal experience. So if I want to be ethical towards myself, I try to use holistic approaches, transfeminist, and uh, and I also try to center my community's resistance and resilience, because often it's easy when you're talking about Indigenous communities or Francophone communities or SLGBTQI plus to concentrate on their struggles, on their challenges, and their obstacles. But it's really important to talk about the resilience and resistance that they've shown over the years. And I also try to honor how my ancestors walked through the world and how they see the world. So I communicate with those who know my community in order to be able to represent ancestors' knowledge and ways of seeing the world through my work. When we talk today about everything, please keep this in mind. And I would like to thank the Learning Network and Western University for the opportunity that they've given me and given our network to talk to you about this very important topic, especially when you think about support and care. And I'm really looking forward to sharing all of this with you today. In particular, I'd like to thank Diane, with whom I coordinated this event, and also Sabri, who is our facilitator today, as well as the whole team behind that set up today's event. And finally, please interact with the Enchanté network. If you work in an organization that offers services related to gender-based violence, you're probably an organization that's eligible to work with the Enchanté network. If not, please do follow us on social media and share with others that we are there, because that's the way we're going to be able to share all the work that they do, that we do for the 2S LGBTQI plus community. So as I mentioned earlier on, first of all, we're going to talk about the importance of including persons of diverse gender identities and providing context for the role of gender inclusion in creating a supportive community. I know that I'm talking today to people who want to offer services to people of all identities. But right now, we're going to be looking at more specifically at the realities of two-spirit persons and also non-binary persons, as well as trans persons. And we'll also talk about oppressive systems that impact their realities and the environment they live in. And finally, we'll talk about the specificities of the Francophone minority context in Canada, the importance of inclusion, the realities of gender diverse peoples, and the specificities of the Francophone minority in Canada will enable us to look at solutions and ideas to create anti-oppressive, anti-racist, and trans-affirming spaces for trans persons and gender diverse persons. So I hope you're all ready to start this adventure with me. And I just wanted to mention to you, this is not a 101 course. There might be terms or words that you're not very familiar with. And that's why I encourage you to open up a web window with Google and use your favorite search engine to look up these words and during our conversation. And please note these words and do perhaps a little bit of research after today's webinar, I hope. So now let's look at our content. Let's start with exploring the realities of persons of diverse gender identities. We're going to talk a bit about their environment and the context they live in. We'll talk about physical and material security. We'll talk about social and interpersonal issues, as well as access to services. And I always start with the environment and the context. What's important to remember is that trans, two-spirit, and non-binary people are not fundamentally problematic people. They are not necessarily born with mental health problems, or they don't encounter barriers in their lives automatically. It's because of where we're living now. I'm going to talk mostly about the neo-colonial context in Canada, and that's what creates a social context which is very challenging for people who are gender diverse. So I'm going to talk about 5 systems of oppression. There's the colonial system, there's patriarchy, there's white supremacy, capitalism, and cis heteronormativity. And I'm not going to go into detail on this. I'm just going to give an overview. But what's important is that I'm going to establish connections with the reality of gender diverse people. And it's important to realize that these different systems are related to each other, and they also have an effect on gender diverse people and others. But today we're talking about gender diverse people. And let's start with the colonial system. Research and documents and teachings from Indigenous communities have taught us that before contact with Europeans, there were non-binary gender models. And within their communities, these non-binary people held important roles. They were leaders, they were healers, they were people who could see further than what's happening just in today's world. They could see much further than the model that we live with. And they could, and it was very hard to occupy these roles and learn what these people knew. We call these people two-spirit people, and as I said, they played very important roles. But when the colonizers, the Europeans, arrived in Turtle Island, very quickly they realized what the role and the importance of these people were within their communities. And these were the first people to be murdered or assimilated, in particular via the residential schools, where non-conforming two-spirited people had to wear very binary European clothing, and they were categorized as being either men or women according to their visible genitals. It was the beginning of when the colonizers arrived. They imposed a binary concept of gender. And today we still feel the impact of the arrival of the colonizers. And this will enable you to understand how we have fought against this binary approach. Now let's go on to white supremacy, which goes hand in hand with colonization. White supremacy is a system or an ideology that says that whites are superior to other races and others should be under their thumb or marginalized. In our society, publicly, there are very few people who call themselves white supremacists because it's considered to be a very extremist racist term. However, it's a concept and an ideology which is very deeply anchored in our society. And it's hard to identify these elements in our daily lives, but racialized people, indigenous people, immigrants, or Blacks, or people of color feel what white supremacy means throughout government, throughout various institutions like government and in their daily lives. Whether or not white supremacy is overt, it still underpins violence in our society, slavery, of racial segregation. And as I said, these beliefs permeate society and they still exist. And white supremacy is, and we live in a white supremacist society. Now, let's go on to the patriarchy, which is also a system that, a cultural, social system that puts white men above others. And within systems of power and institutions. It's a system that maintains that people who are not white men are weaker, have less power. And this gives them the right to oppress women, to impose themselves in the workplace. It creates salary, job inequity. It means that women are less represented within the political sphere. So it devalues femininity, and it sets strict standards that define masculinity. The patriarchy is very toxic. It's very bad for men too. Even though they're on a pedestal within their communities, it sets up inaccessible objectives, unsustainable objectives for men and masculinity in general. And it creates mental health problems, suicide problems related to suicide amongst men, and men who see themselves as masculinists, in other words, the opposite of feminism, feminists, masculinists say that we shouldn't be talking about patriarchy, but in fact, patriarchy is something that harms men too. Patriarchy is strongly linked to colonialism, since once again, it's the white European man who brought this construct, this social construct here, even though certain indigenous communities also operate on a patriarchal system. So the last point is capitalism. It's important to talk about capitalism and gender because it's an economic system that benefits from maintaining strict social norms around binary gender ideas. these these oppressive gender norms include pay equity, inequities rather, gendered work, work that women take on because they are seen as being caring, empathetic, kind, warm, whereas men are supposed to be cold, materialistic, emotional, but more in terms of anger. And there are different working standards, different standards within the workplace, like parental leave. Women are expected to stay home longer than men, whereas in certain families, this isn't how it works. And the man has to take care of the children. But with these parental leaves, they can't do so. So capitalism reinforces and implements practices based on binary gender ideas. It is beneficial to the rich, and most of these rich people are men.
And finally, I'd like to speak about cis heteronormativity. So, being cisgendered means identifying with the gender that was assigned to you at the time of your birth. And so, this concept means that when we see someone in the street, the person's gender identity corresponds with their gender expression, that is to say, the way they present themselves. And it is also the expectation that this person, if it's a man, that they will be attracted to women and will get married to a woman and have children with a woman and so on. So today it is this cis heteronormativity which brings about daily microaggressions and also results in harmful stereotyping. Another important thing is that if the majority of these beliefs are rooted in the notion of white supremacy, colonization, and Eurocentrism, well, we can understand that gender diverse people who are also racialized or who are non-white are therefore in an even more disadvantaged situation and face even more barriers. So we've spoken about capitalism, colonialism, white supremacy, and another one which I've forgotten. But all of this brings about cis heteronormativity, where we have concrete expectations based on binary notions of gender and puts everyone in the same basket. And this also creates challenges in terms of people's ability to come out. And it's quite difficult to do this today because everyone expects us to be the gender which they see on the surface. And so we'll just take 10 minutes to talk about the environment and the context. And now we're going to talk, or rather, the systems of oppression. And now we're going to talk about LGBT and T rights in the LGBT acronym, which is, of course, the first letters in terms of the advocacy for LGBTQ people. And within our communities, and within the queer community, for example, this community is not immune to the effects of colonialism and to cis heteronormativity. Over the years, throughout various advocacy movements, there has been an effort to erase gender diverse people within these movements, and we've seen a resurgence of white lesbian, and gay people who are who are taking photos as representatives of these movements. And these were the people who were the most acceptable according to cis heteronormative concepts and beliefs. So trans people, gender diverse people, two-spirited people were erased from these movements, and therefore this was simply to promote LGB rights instead of the rights of these peoples. So there's a particular importance when it comes to racialized people in this category. And in the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s, this whole process was amplified by the AIDS crisis, where racialized people and trans people were affected by AIDS, and they had lesser access to support. And so today there are very few elderly people who are trans or racialized trans elderly people because these people had much less support during the course of the AIDS crisis. And so this is the result of AIDS, the erasure of their identities, and all of this has materialized today in the form of concrete impacts within Canadian society in 2023. So these people are still being marginalized. Trans people are not perceived as gay and lesbian people within our society. So there's a great deal of work that needs to be done in terms of awareness of trans people, two-spirited people, and non-binary people. And this, of course, brings about debates as to the legitimacy of these identities. And in the United States, currently, there's an alarming number of bills which have been brought forward in legislatures to ban drag queens. So this legislation is the beginning of the process to criminalize gender diverse people. Because, for example, if there's a man who dresses as a woman for their work, as to say being a drag queen, they don't have the right to do this. But if someone sees a trans woman or someone who's assigned as a man at their time of their birth, well, the laws are so sneaky and so well drafted so as to favor the people who are against gender diverse people. And so, therefore, these people may also be affected by drag queen related legislation, and this can bring about violence. There's been an increase of murder and violence toward trans people, specifically trans racialized people, and there's also political violence. So our identities, our realities are being discussed and debated by people in positions of power, and this is very difficult morally, mentally, and it also brings about concerns regarding our quality of life in the long term. So the erasure of LGBT rights, despite the progress that has been made over the last decades, well, we still have the impression that we have been left behind. So I will now move on to the question of physical material security. And so we're going to discuss the daily realities, not so much on the systemic level, but more on an interpersonal level. So trans, two-spirit, non-binary people are more at risk of being the subject of certain types of violence, and they face very specific barriers. So first, I'll talk about violence. And so according to StatsCan, transgender Canadians are 3 times more likely to experience violent victimization or to face non-consensual sexual behavior. And 3 times more likely, well, that's quite significant. Gender diverse people are also more likely to various types of violence, whether it's physical, sexual, emotional, verbal, public, police, political, and they also face hate crimes. So this increase in violence is amplified by the social isolation that trans and gender diverse people experience, and there are also various stereotypes with respect to these people. There's hateful public discourse, and there are various oppressive systems, the ones which we've already discussed today. So in terms of barriers, well, in terms of employment, there's discrimination and harassment in the workplace, and these have been concretely assessed and quantified by, for example, StatsCan in 2018, and 69.4 of transgender people had experienced inappropriate behavior in the workplace over the last 12 months. And this is compared to a striking 22.5% for their cisgender peers. That's to say, people who identify with the gender that was assigned to them at the time of their birth. 69.4 versus 22.5. Well, I'd ask that you keep these numbers in mind. When I was making this presentation, I was going over all my statistics, And I was taking a look at all the resources that I've used over the years and to see this enormous disparity between the two numbers, well, it made me realize how urgent the current situation is and how important it is to include gender diverse people in support services, in support communities. And it's very important for today's discussions. So, another study that was done by Transpulse Canada, according to the study, racialized and transgender persons have a greater chance of experiencing discrimination in the workplace or in school. So 45%, which is racialized transgender people, so there's people at the intersection of these two identities, and 37% for white transgender people. So this is discrimination in the workplace or in school. So we're talking about colonialism, white supremacy, and this is also seen in trans people's experiences, two-spirited people's experiences, and non-binary people's experiences. So these components of discrimination are caused by various things. For example, a lack of awareness, a lack of appropriate support. So if I, as a trans feminine person, if I were to be working somewhere and if my supervisor or the person who was supervising me was not aware of what it means to be transgender, what it means to work as a trans feminine person, well, then of course this could bring about experiences that may be perceived as harassment. And there's also a lack of direct support. So I wouldn't know, for example, who to talk to within the organization. And that would mean that I might experience burnout, or maybe I'd want to quit the job. So this would also contribute to my financial instability, problems in terms of my quality of life, etc. And so these discrimination and harassment experiences are also reflected in school settings. So non-binary, two-spirit, and transgender people face very specific barriers in terms of education. For example, the type of documentation that schools use, the use of legal names compared with the preferred name of someone. So this can bring about a use of inappropriate names or denaming. So these education-related barriers bring about higher dropout rates among transgender, two-spirit, and non-binary people. And in terms of workplaces, if we take a look at insurance coverage, often insurance coverage provided by employers do not cover certain medications that transgender people take for their transitions, for example, hormones, hormone therapy, and the insurance policies often don't cover leave for a gender affirming surgery. For example, gender reassignment, or I forget the word, but a gender affirming surgery. So insurance policies often don't cover a long enough leave period, or they simply don't cover these types of care, which are essential for the physical safety of gender diverse people. According to a recent study, so now we're going to take a look at housing. According to a study done in 2022, between 25 and 40% of youth experiencing homelessness identify as 2SLGBTQIA+, and 10% of Canadians are members of this community. So if we represent 10% of Canada's population, and if 25 to 40% of youth experiencing homelessness identify as members of this community, then there is a big problem in terms of the proportions. And these housing related problems can be caused by different things. For example, discrimination by landowners and by renters. So if someone doesn't have a binary form of gender expression, if they go to look at a new place to rent, perhaps the owner will see that the person is transgender and decide to select another renter. instead of the transgender person. And in terms of this discrimination by landlords, while there can also be discrimination by other residents in the building, they will make frivolous complaints to the landlord, for example. This can bring about evictions, which are unjustified or improper. And if we think about the housing related justice system, which is utterly overwhelmed, and the processes take over a year when it comes to investigating these issues. Well, we can be it may seem hopeless to make any kind of complaint, and unfortunately these justice systems are often very discriminatory, and so it's just a waste of our time to bring forward any type of complaint. And there's also a shortage of affordable housing, and everyone, I'm sure, is aware of the housing crisis. And transgender people, in addition to facing issues in terms of financial stability, well, this can mean that transgender people often end up homeless and they simply don't have access to affordable housing. So this brings me to my slide on access to services. I just like to talk about a few things in terms of access to services. When we think about, for example, healthcare, government services, community services, and as I've been mentioning for the last 20 minutes, there's a great lack of awareness in this area, and there are also a number of problems in terms of the validation of these people. For example, community services, when a trans feminine person who hasn't gone through a transition process that is visible, and so they still dress like a man, and often this type of person can be misgendered. And so this brings about inappropriate access to support. There are material security concerns, physical security concerns, which are amplified when accessing these services. Often it's difficult to be anonymous when accessing these services. So we sometimes need to mention that we're trans because a piece of identity sometimes doesn't reflect the gender that we identify with. So it creates a lot of problems in terms of accessing these services. And this means often, and in fact, this is a phenomenon that I often discuss with my community, where we have to wait for a very long time to go to the hospital if we have a health problem, because we know what's going to happen from these experiences. So perhaps we'll be told that our healthcare problem is related to our hormone treatment, whereas the majority of the time this is not the case. And we could be misgendered or simply be disrespected or pathologized, and we can be told that we're dealing with some sort of mental health problem. And so healthcare professionals unfortunately think often in this way. So this means often that gender diverse people and transgender people are not able to access these services, and they deal with all kinds of systemic and social problems as a result. So now the social and interpersonal dimension. So the the systems in place in the Canadian context of and as a result of the preconceived notions of gender diversity and the barriers to access the elements needed to survive in a capitalist environment, for example, employment, education, housing, persons of diverse gender identities often find themselves in complex interpersonal situations. For example, family relations. We may be cut off from our family. There may be violence or various other complex relations. We can think about emotional relations, romantic relations, and transgender people may, for example, depend on someone else for housing. And so sometimes violence can be exacerbated. And there's also very limited community connections between transgender people. For example, in Kingston, there are a few organizations. I live in Kingston. There are a few organizations which connect transgender people, but there's no services available in French. No service at all available in French. And so this brings me to speak now about the specificities of the Francophone minority context. So I'll get started right away because I'd like to keep to our schedule. So when we think about speaking French and gender, well, French is a fundamentally gendered language, much more so than English. And if you'll allow me to share a personal experience, my transition in English went much better than with people who speak French because there are fewer words which allow me to express my gender in a concrete manner. So this brings about significant challenges. And when we speak to someone in French, very quickly we understand how the person perceives us. In English, if the person doesn't use miss or ma'am or doesn't use a gendered pronoun, it would be difficult for me to know whether I'm being perceived as a man or a woman, as a non-binary gendered person. So in French, we can understand very quickly based on adjectives or whether I'm being perceived as a man or a woman. So there are many linguistic obstacles that arise in these situations. So it took me 6 or 8 months before I was able to share my social transition, which was very much underway in English, but it was more difficult for me to do this in French. It was the whole process was delayed because I was concerned that if someone would make a mistake, that it would happen much more frequently than in English. So a few things to keep in mind when we're speaking French and when we're serving gender diverse people. First of all, Mr. and Mrs., these are forms of colonial courtesy and they're not necessary because we can use our first name or our last name, but often when we're accessing community services, care services, support services, Mr. and Mrs., well, these terms are rarely useful. And assuming someone's gender based on what you can see, based on someone's clothing, someone's hair, someone's appearance, assuming gender, this is something to be avoided. And instead, we can offer our own pronouns and ask the person what their pronouns are. So we can say, hello, my name is Zachary. I use the pronoun she, they. Are there any pronouns which you would like me to use? Would you like to share your pronouns? We can always ask this question. And if the person doesn't want to reveal their pronouns, if they're thinking about their own safety or if they're with someone who is a caregiver or a parent, and perhaps this person hasn't yet come out as a gender diverse person, well, you can simply use the person's name, and sometimes it will seem less natural, but it's nonetheless something that can be done. Zachary, for example, is an artist. He's a Francophone engagement coordinator and likes lasagna. So pronouns can be replaced by someone's name, and when a transgender person is in an unsafe space, well, it might be the best way to refer to them. So in writing, we can use an inclusive form of writing, and in French, the written language is much simpler than a spoken language. I'll share a few examples. So I'll share a few examples of gender neutral language. So this means a neutral type of language that doesn't suggest any gender. So you can see here uh, a gender neutral versus an inclusive sentence. The people receiving our services are people who have experienced domestic violence. And so in inclusive language, this could be said that people using our services are all survivors of domestic violence. And so in the written form, it's much easier than the spoken form because sometimes we need to say both the masculine and feminine form of a word in French. And sometimes it's good to switch the order of these two forms to counter the masculinist movement within the French language. So I would invite you to play with these two types of writing and to figure out what to you is the most natural way of expressing things, what's the most natural way of doing things in your particular milieu. And I would invite you to use a non-gendered language in your writing, and I would also ask that you seek out resources on this topic. So there's an organization called Divergent, which is a member of the Enchanted network and which has created a guide for neutral and inclusive grammar. And so this will give you some information on how to use gender neutral writing and language. And an excellent resource is the Club Sexu Inclusive Writing Guide. It's an organization that does exceptional work in Montreal, and you can find this guide, uh, and it also will provide you with access to various other resources on the topic. And it's very important to say that, for example, I might prefer one type of writing, but another person might prefer another one. So keep this in mind when you're writing. You need to be flexible. If we use a more diverse gender lens, then then we may continue to perpetuate errors. So make sure to be flexible when it comes to referring to various people, and make sure you know what the person that you're talking to whom you're talking, what their preferences are. And so I believe it was on October 4th, 2022, when the government of Canada issued its guidelines and resources on inclusive writing. So this shows that the government is making progress, that the government also recognizes the importance of inclusive writing when it comes to feminist beliefs, but also trans affirming beliefs. So this is something that's a little bit less flexible, and I would recommend that you use community resources, which are a little bit more up to date with the needs of Francophone transgender people. And these guidelines can be an excellent tool to speak to these subjects, to speak about these subjects with your managers. Zachary, if would you mind just speaking a little bit louder? Yes, no problem. Thank you. So I'll just keep going. And on the next slide, so we're going to talk about concrete avenues for discussions within the Francophone community. There is a very concrete religious element, which is still seen today. So the Catholic Church represented the interests of Francophones in their relations with government. And this was the case for much of the 20th century. And today, community organizations perform this responsibility. And these community organizations have many conservative values. And so, unfortunately, things move a little bit more slowly in this context. And I was going to move to the next slide. So here we're talking about Catholic Francophone schools, and you must understand that the Francophone situation is influenced by Catholic schools. So I don't want to speak ill of religion. However, we should recognize the fact that Catholic beliefs were imposed in our communities and that they had harmful effects in terms of assimilation, via conversion therapy, etc. So I'm just going to move forward a little bit quicker. So in terms of community awareness, often I'm told, and in fact, I've said it, that you're either queer or francophone. But we shouldn't have to choose between the two. But there's a lack of resources in French to speak about queer realities or gender diverse realities, and there's also a lack of funding for to LGBTQ organizations. So this exacerbates the lack of resources, the lack of services, etc. And the idea of intersectionality, which in the Anglophone world is poorly understood, and in the Francophone minority context, well, and this is very different than in Quebec, intersectionality within the Francophone minority context, it's something that we've been talking about for the last decade, maybe for the last 15 years. And it's something very new compared with the Anglophone community. Francophones often speak about Francophone issues, and sometimes we're not able to speak about Aboriginal questions, queer questions, transgender questions, the questions of people living with disabilities. And so this often means that the various issues are prioritized. So we need to promote this awareness within our community. And given that there's a lack of funding and a lack of services for Francophone organizations in general, Francophone organizations, even not queer organizations, but simply Francophone organizations, are underfunded, and there's also a great deal of delay in terms of their access to funding. There's a lack of resources for awareness raising. There's a lack of resources for the to us LGBTQ plus community. There's a lack of trans affirming services. And an example that I'd like to give you is that, for example, I, as a transgender person, if I were going to get healthcare services, I first of all have to ask myself, well, do I have access to services which take into consideration the realities of Aboriginal people? Will people gender me correctly? Will they use the right name? Am I going to be able to have access to hormones and hormone therapy and to gender affirming therapies? All of these questions often mean that I wonder whether I'm going to be able to get these services in French. So I simply have to end up getting these services in English.
So, Zakary, you can take a little bit more time if you want. Don't rush. Don't rush. Thank you very much. It's greatly appreciated. There's so many things that I need to talk about, and I'm trying to get the ideas across as much as possible, but a presentation that takes just an hour and a quarter, an hour and a half is not enough to show how to serve trans people. So I invite you to continue discussions within your organizations and try and find more support and more training. And so, as a matter of fact, we're going to be talking about cross-cutting principles to create caring and supportive communities. And then we'll talk about creating safe spaces and organizational structures and creating appropriate and informed services. So here are a few ideas. When I'm asked to talk about inclusion uh, uh, with respect to 2S LGBTQI plus groups, the first thing is you don't need to know all the letters in the acronym and all the letters to understand queer people and respect them. These are two completely different things. And it's very important to give dignity to the people around you and to show good faith in order to be able to serve them properly. So it's important to understand. Today, we looked at a lot of tools to help you understand, but what's important is first is to respect people. And I always insist on self-determination and empowerment of the people that you serve. We were talking about inclusive language, for instance, if somebody says they want to be addressed with a pronoun that you don't know or something that you don't understand, you have to believe in their independence and empower them. So self-determination and empowerment are some of the first things you have to take into account. Then there's individuality of experiences. As a trans person, I may have specific experiences that are impacted by where I live, by my family, by my age, by my level of education, by the access to work that I have. So my experiences are always going to be completely different from another trans person who comes into the team or the group. So you have to respect the individuality of the people you're serving. And then there's trans joy. It's important to give services that meet the challenges and the issues and the realities of gender diverse people. And it's important to celebrate what's positive about being trans. Being trans for me freed me. It was a very powerful tool that helps me to communicate, to act, to go through life. My life has been completely changed by this identity and by the vocabulary that I can now use. So I like to receive services that not only help me to navigate the system, but also recognize me and show the joy of being trans. And then there's intersectionality. We have to talk about intersectionality. We have to share our knowledge about intersectionality to ensure that that we recognize all the identities so that people will receive the services that they need. And finally, assume nothing. I offered services to young people for a while, young people from other privileged groups and people who had just arrived in the country. And what I did every time I met people or talked to them, what I did was never assume anything. As soon as I opened the door, I forget everything I know about the person, everything that I've read in their file. It's very important to do this and just listen to the person and give the person an opportunity to communicate more information to you. So don't assume anything, and take what they have to say to you and use, of course, your knowledge and your personal experience. Now, if we go back to organizational structures, the structures within your services and your organizations, policies, procedures, processes, often the guidelines for if you're not an organization that takes into account diverse gender people, often it means that you're not taking into account these people. You have to acknowledge them, recognize them. You have to say, there's no one in my team who is trans or who is not or who is gender diverse or who is trans. And because of that, it may cause problems. It's not that you've done something wrong. It's just that maybe you do things because you haven't had the opportunity to change your ways of doing things. So you have to decolonize yourself and question your internal systems. We know that binary gender norms and systems that impact trans people come from white supremacist colonial structures, and you should start implementing indigenous ways of doing things, because implementing these traditional systems enables us to be more humane. So I really invite you to decolonialize your work. Third thing is, question your intentions. Why do I want to make this space more inclusive? Is it to be able to say that this space is more inclusive? Is it to be able to just say it on social media, we're trans inclusive, we're trans friendly? Or do you really want to better serve people and offer services to people that will really transform the lives of these gender diverse people? So question what your intentions are, and then look at the current state of affairs. What are you doing now? What are the services you offer? What are the processes and the policies that you have? And then you'll be able to see what has to be done to sometimes eradicate the problems. And finally, create a concrete action plan. What do you intend to do? What are the commitments you're making? How are you going to communicate with trans communities, with other communities, with the communities that are impacted by your work? So your intentions, then you think about what you're doing now. It's important to connect this to the reality in the workplace, and that will enable you to establish concrete action plans. And here are some things to assess and to think about. Any previous efforts to raise awareness in your team and to learn? Have you worked in the past with trans or gender diverse people? What was the effect? Was it positive? Was it negative? Did you get any comments from gender diversity people? Were there people gender diverse people in leadership positions? Were they on the front lines, or were they just on contract? Often trans people are hired on short-term contracts. They have very little financial and employment stability due to the fact that they're always looking for the next job or self-advocating to get their contracts renewed. Then look at your HR policies, your and look about your process is to give feedback, ask for comments. Do you have a system that invites people in, that's anonymous and that's safe? You have to think about all of this. And finally, to create safe spaces, you need to define the people you're creating the spaces for. And then you have to consult with these communities constantly, not just once, every 5 years. You have to constantly, concretely create sustainable relationships with these people, and even hire consultants, outside consultants sometimes, to provide support. Then you have to ensure that your organizational foundations, your policies, procedures, etc., allow you to welcome in not only the people you want to serve, but also the people you work with. Your insurance, you have to look at your insurance programs, your hiring processes, the application forms when people are coming for a job. And this is my favorite part of the workshop, and I really like to talk about this. You have to apply the care principles and the principles of trauma-informed care to our practices, and do this in a way that shows dignity and empowers people, so that the people, so that you can serve these people and give them the tools so that people can stand in their identity, to know who they are, to walk through life properly, and have a sense of dignity. And my last slide is considerations when creating inclusive spaces for persons of diverse gender identities. First of all, anonymity, not just of the individual, but also of their identity. For instance, if I come into your organization and I say I'm trans, it doesn't mean that I want everybody to know that I am. So you have to ensure anonymity and barriers. You have to be explicit in inclusion. You have to understand the dynamics of inter-community violence within queer communities. There's a book that I recommend written by Kai-Ching Tom, I Hope We Choose Love, where they talk about problems of violence in queer communities. We're not immune to violence. We're not saints within our community. Interactions with police or other forms of authority. Think about how the police and other forms of authority interact with the people you work with. For instance, the use of the legal name rather than the name the person wants to be known by. And also think about emergency measures. Are there any isolated are there any places where someone can go to be alone when they feel triggered, for instance? And service promotion. How do you ensure inclusion when you provide services? And the last point, I see Sabri, so I'll be fast. In order to support persons of diverse gender identities, we must not forget that services must support them through services must support them in different ways. First of all, they have to be able to navigate the system. How do we support trans people to create a circle of care? And then there's physical and material security. How do we support people in that on that level too? Of course, you can't do everything, but you have to develop partnership or relationships with organizations that address the needs of the people that you are not able to care for. And now, after this long presentation full of little bits and pieces of information, I'd like to thank you, Miigwech. Thank you for being here, for having listened to me. And now I really look forward to answering your questions. I see there are a number of questions already, and there are comments in the chat, and I can't wait to be able to answer them for you. Thank you, Zachary, for your very interesting presentation. And now we're going to go into the question and answer period. The first question The first question is, how can people act as allies to gender diverse people? I think that it depends on a number of things. I'd like to go back to something that I mentioned. Understanding doesn't mean respecting. And if you don't understand, it doesn't mean that you can't respect. So first of all, I encourage you to understand and do research, but first and foremost, respect the people around you and give them the benefit of the doubt, as we say, the belief that they are masters of their own experience and that they know what's best for themselves. And to be an ally, I first and foremost encourage you to think about your knowledge and to think about how you approach a relationship with these people. Another thing that I want to bring up is in terms of the ally movement, this is a discussion that we've been having more and more since Black Lives Matter came out in 2020. It's a concept that everybody's talking about, but often it's an individualized concept. You listen to a podcast at home, or you watch a documentary, or you read a book, and you don't get into conversations with your peers because you're afraid of saying the wrong thing, you're afraid of hurting people. And the fear of having conversations blocks us as communities, and we can't become allies for the people that we're in contact with. So I encourage you to break down these barriers and work with the community.
Thank you, Zachary, for your response. Do you have any advice on uh, explaining what your pronouns are in the context of an access to therapy? I'm a therapist in an organization that provides therapy to victims of domestic violence. I'm reluctant to use my pronouns when I'm dealing with parents and their children because I'm concerned about facing a transphobic response. Yes, well, this, of course, will impact the work that you're able to do with the person that you're serving, and it may create a precarious situation in terms of your employment if the parent complains, and it might be a very difficult situation to navigate. And what I know from my personal experience is that every time when I've been able to share my pronouns, it's always brought about a learning experience, and it's also allowed me to better understand my limits in terms of my work. And I've had negative experiences. People perhaps didn't understand, or they were very much against my identity. And this allowed me to have discussions with my employer to speak about my limits and also the support that I could be offered in my workplace. So I would encourage you to share these pronouns and to listen to your body. And if you feel like you're safe, that probably means, or if this is not the case, this probably means there's something that needs to be done. So I hope this was helpful. Thank you, Zachary. There's another question. French is my second language, and I work more in English than in French in healthcare. Can you say what the most used non-binary pronouns are? Yes, I can. In French, we've got a pronoun which is very common, which it's the pronoun yel, and it's spelled I-E-L, and it's a mix of il and elle, and it's an example of a non-binary pronoun. There are, in fact, researchers who have found writing in Europe from medieval times, which refer to these types of non-gendered pronouns such as al, al, or ul, ul, or ol, ol. So I can see in the chat that people have written yel, and that's sort of the equivalent of they in English. So there are a number of options in French, but the most frequently used one is yel. Thank you, Zachary, for your answer. Next question is, I work for the Hastings Prince Edward Alzheimer's Society. We have a support group for people dealing with dementia. We have mixed groups and we have men's and women's groups. How can a non-binary or two-spirit person make the decision of which group to belong to, whether it's one of these sex groups or one of these mixed groups?
C'est sûr que je peux principalement partager sur qu'est-ce que moi je ferais dans cette
I could
situation-là.
explain to you what exactly I would do in this situation, but I can't speak on behalf of all gender diverse people. And probably I would choose to not use these services, unfortunately, because I know
La base des réflexions de
that
la création des services que vous
if
offrez est
at the
biblique. Moi, c'est pas quelque chose
if
qui
the binary notion is at the basis
me
the base of these services, and I as a transgender person, a trans feminine person,
de
and I have a way of expressing myself that is more feminine, I would be more inclined to join the women's group. But of course, my experience might not be understood by everyone, and I may not be welcomed there. So I would have a lot of difficulty in taking advantage or making use of these types of service. I'm speaking on behalf of myself and perhaps on behalf of other gender diverse people, but I would rarely use any type of service which are so binary in nature.
Merci Zachary.
Thank you, Zachary. A little question. Is there a list of the 22 Francophone organizations that work with the Enchanted network? As was mentioned on the first slide, there's no concrete list, but would you feel comfortable sharing my email? And if so, I'd be happy to give you access to a list, and you can also go on the Enchanté or the Enchanted website, and you can find the names of these organizations. Another question: I work in the area of I work in an area that serves children, and I believe that there are certain archaic elements in the justice system when it comes to transgender questions in terms of asking the children questions. I'm working with some people who are asking their children to identify differently in various contexts, and it's uh, causing quite a bit of difficulty among with this young person who's dealing with this situation. What type of efforts do you think that we could provide to assist this person? I'm sorry, that was a lot of information. Is this question in the Q&A? There's a lot of information. Yes, it's in the Q&A.
Ah, voilà, je la trouve, je la trouve, je la trouve. Merci beaucoup.
Ah, yes, I see it.
Je suis pas une professionnelle de la justice.
I'm not a legal professional, but the first thing that comes to mind is that we could refer you to an organization called Just Trans Justice, which is a national organization that does research on the legal rights of transgender people in different provinces and territories. So I would encourage you to contact this organization, and they would be able to provide you with more information. And the thing that interests me the most about this question is the fact that a young person was being asked to use different terms, or the question of being open or not to their own identity in various settings. And this, of course, can have an effect on one's physical and mental health. So I'm not sure if I've got all the tools to answer this question completely, but this was an important question to ask aloud. But I would ask you to get in touch with Justice Trans, and that might help you get access to the information that you need. I'm sorry, I'm not equipped to provide a comprehensive answer. Thank you. The next question. As a healthcare service provider, I work with Indigenous children and their families on reserve. I have encountered families where the parents don't accept the identity of their children. This can make the relationship between parent and child very tense. So, do you have any recommendations to improve this type of relationship between parent and child? Maybe some books or some brochures? First of all, it's a little bit less concrete in terms of resources, but if a parent is against the identity of their child and is trying to force them to go back into the closet or refusing to uh, use their terms. I mean, this can be as a result of a lack of awareness or as a result of the parents' beliefs, but it is something that can be resolved. So the conversation that is necessary to have so as to determine why the child's identity is being rejected. Well, this is the first step to determine what's necessary to do with the adults so that the child can have access to a more inclusive family setting in terms of
et de livres.
resources
Je
and
vais, si
books.
vous me le permettez, je ne sais pas si c'est
If
quelque chose qui est possible, mais j'ai une
I'm not
liste
sure if this is possible, but in fact,
d'informations
I've got a list
précises dessus, mais je pourrais
and
l'envoyer
I
à un des
could
représentants du
send it
Learning Network. Ça pourrait être
to a representative of the Learning Network,
attaché aussi aux
and
ressources qui vont être sur le site web.
this is also something that's available, or could perhaps be added to the website. Yes, if you could send us the list, then we could share it to all the share it with all the participants. Okay, we'll just have one more question before we end our webinar. I work in housing for in the area of domestic violence. So I'm wondering what you
C'est une
think
grande question.
about
C'est pas la première fois qu'on me la pose, surtout pour les centres
this
qui
particular
sont des
question.
centres pour femmes.
Yes, in terms of these women's
L'absence de diversité
centers,
de genre
it
met
seems to
vraiment en
me
question
that the
l'impact
presence of gender
négatif que la
diversity does
société que les
not
femmes peuvent vivre. Et
reflect the negative impact that women can face
peut être vécu par des femmes.
and all the negative experiences which may arise in this type of situation. It's a very complicated situation. Here, I think about the idea of self-determination for transgender people, but also for women who are in these centers and perhaps who don't feel comfortable living with someone who is transgender. So there's a difference between not wanting to live with someone who's transgender as a result of stereotypes or as a result of simply not being aware of their reality or simply refusing their reality as a result of their beliefs. And this is different from a woman who's experienced trauma, something which may continue to affect her well-being. So if a woman explains her rejection of the person and assuming it's not based on harmful or incorrect stereotypes as a trans feminine person and as someone who may access these services, I would hope that when I approach a service provider which is supposed to be providing services to women, then I would hope that there would be a certain flexibility. If I were to explain my experiences, I would hope that they would understand my reality. And if the service provider could provide resources or have discussions so that women could understand my reality, and perhaps it would be possible to develop a strategy to better welcome me. So the question is, should we get rid of these types of centers for women? Well, this is an extremely broad question, and given that we only have 3.5 minutes, I simply won't be able to provide you with an exhaustive response. But self-determination, flexibility, and this applies to gender diverse people, but also to women who are accessing these services. Thank you, Zakary, for your answer. We have a number of other questions, but we're not unfortunately going to be able to get to them because this is all the time that we have today. Thank you again very much, Zakary, for being with us today. And thank you to all the participants. Thank you very much to our interpreters, Wendy and Peter, as well as our ASL interpreters, Dean and Christy. As soon as the webinar is over, an evaluation form will be sent to you, so please fill it out so as to receive your participation certificate. Thank you, everyone, on behalf of the whole Learning Network team. See you next time.